In the dense, shadowy embrace of the forest, a chilling mist hung low, weaving through the gnarled trees like a living entity. Whispers echoed among the branches, secrets shared by the wind, tales of those who had ventured too far and never returned. One such tale began with a group of friends, curious souls, seeking thrills who decided to camp at the edge of the infamous Horror Forest, a place locals spoke of in hushed tones. They set up their tents as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting elongated shadows that danced ominously around them. As night enveloped the forest, the air grew thick with tension. Laughter turned to unease when they shared stories of the forest's dark history, the disappearances, the unsettling sightings of shadowy figures, and the blood-curdling screams that were said to echo through the trees on quiet nights. Yet, emboldened by camaraderie, they brushed off their fears, convinced that they could brave the night without consequence. But deep down the forest sensed their presence, stirring with an ancient malice. Hours passed, and the fire crackled weakly as they settled into a tentative silence, only to be broken by distant rustling. Each sound seemed amplified in the stillness, heightening their anxiety. They exchanged nervous glances, but one of them, determined to prove their bravery, suggested a midnight hike deeper into the woods. Hesitant yet intrigued, they agreed, convinced that it was just another adventure waiting to unfold. Armed with flashlights, they stepped into the forest, the beam of light slicing through the thick darkness. As they walked, the atmosphere shifted, the trees loomed larger, their twisted branches resembling skeletal hands reaching out to ensnare them. The deeper they went, the more they felt an unseen presence shadowing them, a weight pressing down on their chests. The laughter faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that wrapped around them like a shroud. Suddenly, one of the friends, Rachel, screamed, her flashlight flickering wildly as it illuminated a ghastly figure just beyond the trees. But when they turned to look, it vanished, leaving them breathless and trembling. Dread seeped into their bones as they realized they were no longer merely wandering through the forest, they were being hunted. The group stumbled upon an old cabin, its windows shattered and door hanging ajar, a sinister invitation that none of them wanted to accept. Yet, with nowhere else to go, they stepped inside, the creaking floorboards echoing their trepidation. The air inside was thick with decay, and remnants of old furniture lay strewn about as if the occupants had left in a hurry. In the corner, an ancient, dusty mirror caught Rachel's eye, reflecting not just their images but a distorted, ghostly figure standing just behind them. Panic erupted as they turned to confront the apparition, but the cabin was empty. The friends decided to leave, their hearts pounding, but the forest had shifted, pathways closing off as if the trees conspired to trap them. Fear morphed into desperation as they sprinted back through the maze of trunks, but the forest twisted and turned, disorienting them further. In their frantic escape, they lost sight of one another, calling out into the dark void, voices swallowed by the silence. One by one, they were drawn deeper into the forest's malevolent embrace, each facing their own personal nightmares. Jake stumbled upon a clearing filled with ancient tombstones, each bearing the names of those who had perished in the forest, their dates long faded. He felt a cold hand on his shoulder, turning to find the ghostly figure of a woman, eyes hollow with despair. She whispered warnings of the forest's curse, urging him to flee while he still could. But before he could react, darkness enveloped him, and he was gone. Meanwhile, Sarah and Mark wandered aimlessly, their flashlights flickering ominously. The whispers grew louder, taunting them, urging them to give in to fear. They felt eyes watching from the shadows, always just out of sight. Suddenly, a chilling howl erupted, echoing through the trees, and they dashed toward what they hoped was safety, only to find themselves trapped in a thicket of brambles that seemed to tighten around them. As they struggled, the laughter of unseen spirits filled the air, a mocking chorus that sent shivers down their spines. In the depths of the forest, Rachel was left alone, her heart racing. The trees whispered her name, and she felt an overwhelming presence surrounding her. Desperation clawed at her mind as she recalled the tales of those who had been consumed by the forest. Suddenly she heard a familiar voice calling her from the darkness, but when she turned, she found only shadows lurking in the corners of her vision. Panic surged as she realized she was not alone. The forest had come alive, and it hungered for their fear. Hours passed, or perhaps mere moments' time lost all meaning. The once vibrant friends were now nothing more than memories echoing in the woods. The forest had claimed them, ensnaring their souls, feeding on their terror. The last flicker of hope dimmed as Rachel fell to her knees, the weight of the forest bearing down on her, pulling her into its dark embrace. As she surrendered to the darkness, the forest fell silent once more, waiting patiently for the next curious souls to stumble into its depths, where the shadows whispered and the horrors of the night would unfold again. The forest settled into an eerie stillness, the only sound being the faint rustle of leaves, as if it was catching its breath. Rachel's heart pounded as she knelt on the damp ground, overwhelmed by despair. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around her like a shroud. It whispered promises of safety, of escape, but deep down she knew better. She had heard the stories' tales of those who entered the horror forest and were never seen again. Just as hope began to fade, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness. Rachel squinted, trying to discern if it was friend or foe. As it drew closer, she recognized the form. It was Jake. Relief surged through her, but it was quickly overshadowed by confusion. He looked different, his eyes hollow and sunken, as if the very essence of his being had been drained away. "Rachel," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to get out of here." "It's not safe." "Where are the others?" she asked, panic rising in her throat. "They're lost." "Trapped," he said, his gaze darting nervously around them. "We have to move before it finds us." Without another word, they began to navigate the labyrinth of trees, the underbrush crackling underfoot. Each step felt heavy, as if the forest itself resisted their escape. The whispers intensified, a cacophony of voices that echoed through the darkness, growing more insistent, urging them to stay, to succumb to the forest's will. As they ventured deeper, the landscape began to shift. The trees twisted at unnatural angles, their trunks gnarled and knotted, forming grotesque faces that seemed to sneer at their plight. Shadows danced just beyond the reach of their flashlights, tantalizingly close yet forever out of reach. Rachel clutched Jake's arm, the grip tightening as they pressed on. Suddenly, a chilling laugh erupted from the depths of the forest, echoing off the trees like a sinister symphony. "You can't escape," the voice taunted, dripping with malice. It was as if the forest itself was alive, delighting in their terror. The ground trembled beneath them, and Rachel stumbled, falling to her knees. "Get up," Jake shouted, yanking her to her feet. But before they could move, a thick fog rolled in, obscuring their surroundings. The air grew colder, and the voices became a disorienting blend of cries and laughter, swirling around them. Rachel's heart raced as she felt the ground shift beneath her, as if it were trying to swallow them whole. They pushed through the fog, but it clung to them like a predator, blurring their vision and distorting their senses. In the distance, they thought they saw a flicker of light, perhaps a way out. With renewed hope, they ran toward it, but as they approached, the light flickered out, leaving them engulfed in darkness once more. "Where are we?" Rachel gasped, panic clawing at her throat. "What's happening?" Jake's eyes darted around, a mixture of fear and desperation. "It's like it's playing with us. We have to keep moving." Just then, a chilling howl split the air, echoing through the trees. The sound reverberated in their bones, primal and feral. In a burst of adrenaline, they sprinted away, branches snagging at their clothes, as they stumbled through the underbrush. They could hear something behind them, something large and hungry. "Go," Rachel screamed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They ran blindly, fueled by sheer terror, weaving between the trees as they sought a path to safety. Suddenly, Jake stopped, his flashlight flickering one last time before plunging them into darkness. "Jake!" Rachel cried, fear gripping her heart. She could see nothing, only feel the oppressive weight of the forest pressing in on her. "Where are you?" "Over here," he shouted, his voice strained. Rachel felt her way toward him, but before she reached him, a cold wind swept through the clearing, snatching away the last remnants of warmth. A silhouette loomed ahead, obscured by shadows, and Rachel froze, a chill creeping down her spine. "Jake, we need to go," she urged, but he stood transfixed, eyes wide as he stared at the figure. It was a woman, her face pale and expression twisted in anguish. She raised a hand, beckoning them forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Help me," she pleaded, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You must help me escape." Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Don't listen to her," she yelled, tugging at Jake's arm. "It's a trick." But Jake took a step forward, drawn to the woman's sorrowful gaze. "Maybe she knows how to get out," he murmured, his voice distant. The forest seemed to pulse around them, the trees creaking as if in agreement, and Rachel's heart raced. She knew the stories the forest thrived on fear and despair, luring in unsuspecting souls with promises of salvation. "Jake, please," Rachel cried, desperation flooding her voice. "We have to leave now." The woman's expression shifted, her eyes narrowing. "You'll never escape," she hissed, her voice suddenly harsh. "You belong to the forest now." As the shadows surged forward, engulfing them, Rachel felt Jake slip from her grasp, pulled toward the woman. "No," she screamed, lunging forward, but the darkness closed in around them, the whispers crescendoing into a maddening roar. In that moment of despair, Rachel felt something stir within her, a flicker of defiance. Summoning every ounce of strength, she pushed through the encroaching shadows, reaching for Jake. "Fight it," she shouted, her voice breaking through the chaos. "Remember who you are." Jake hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. The woman shrieked in fury as the forest seemed to quake around them, branches snapping and leaves rustling in a violent gust. Rachel seized the moment, grasping Jake's hand and pulling him back from the brink. Together, they turned and ran, the howls of the forest echoing in their ears. The darkness chased them, clawing at their heels, but they pressed on, desperate to escape the clutches of the horror forest. They navigated the maze of trees, driven by a singular goal: survival. Suddenly they stumbled into a small clearing bathed in moonlight, an oasis of clarity in the suffocating dark. Rachel looked around, gasping for breath, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. "This way," she urged, spotting a narrow path leading out of the forest. But as they ran, the ground trembled and the trees groaned, their branches twisting and reaching as if to grasp them. The forest was fighting back, desperate to reclaim its prey. Shadows lunged from the darkness, threatening to engulf them once more. "Run faster," Rachel yelled, adrenaline surging through her veins. They sprinted toward the path, feeling the oppressive weight of the forest pressing down on them. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of voices that clawed at their minds. Just as they reached the edge of the clearing, Rachel felt a cold hand brush against her ankle, pulling her down. She stumbled, falling to the ground as the shadows swirled around her. "Jake," she cried, reaching out. With a surge of desperation, Jake grabbed her arm, pulling her up just as the darkness threatened to consume her. They surged forward, hearts racing, and finally burst through the tree line, collapsing onto the soft earth outside the forest's grasp. Breathless and trembling, they looked back at the horror forest, the trees standing tall and silent once more. The whispers faded, replaced by the distant sounds of the night crickets chirping, the rustle of leaves in the wind. "We made it," Rachel panted, tears streaming down her cheeks as relief washed over her. But as they stood there, the forest loomed behind them, dark and ominous, waiting patiently for the next unsuspecting souls to wander into its depths. In that moment they knew the truth: the forest was alive, a predator lurking in the shadows, forever hungry for fear. And while they had escaped, the memories of their encounter would haunt them, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. As dawn began to break, casting light on the dark woods, they turned away, determined never to return to the horror forest again, but knowing the shadows would always whisper their names. The dawn light filtered through the trees, but the warmth it promised felt distant and hollow. Rachel and Jake stood at the forest's edge, trembling from their harrowing escape. Yet, the sense of relief was fleeting. They could still hear the faint echoes of the forest's whispers, clawing at the edges of their minds. As they began to walk away, Jake stopped suddenly, his expression shifting from relief to dread. "Rachel, do you feel that?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" she replied, anxiety prickling her skin. It's watching us," he whispered, a shiver running down his spine. Rachel turned back toward the trees, her heart racing anew. The forest seemed to shimmer, as if it were alive, pulsating with an ominous energy. They pushed forward, trying to shake off the unease, but the sensation of being pursued lingered like a shadow. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, yet the forest seemed to cast a long, foreboding shadow over their path. They stumbled upon an old, abandoned road that wound away from the forest. It was overgrown with weeds and crumbled in places, but it felt like a lifeline. "We should follow this," Rachel suggested, hope igniting within her. "It might lead us to safety." As they walked, the air grew thick with silence, the usual sounds of nature muted. No birds chirped, no rustle of small animals, only the sound of their footsteps on the gravel. It felt wrong, like the world had been drained of colour. Suddenly, Rachel spotted something in the distance, a shape standing in the middle of the road. Her heart raced as they approached. It was a wooden signpost, weathered and splintered, with faded letters, barely legible: "Horror Forest, turn back." "What does that mean?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. "It's a warning," Rachel murmured. "But we're not going back." They continued onward, but unease gnawed at them. The deeper they went, the more the world around them twisted. Shadows flitted between the trees, whispering their names, taunting them with the memories of the forest. Just as Rachel felt they were finally free, the air shifted abruptly. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a banshee, and the shadows thickened. "We need to hurry," she shouted, urgency flooding her voice. In a panic, they broke into a run. But the road seemed to stretch endlessly, and every time they looked back, the forest appeared closer, its branches reaching out as if trying to reclaim them. The whispers turned to screams, echoing their own fears back at them. "You cannot escape," they cried. Desperation clawed at Rachel's heart as they pushed onward, but just as hope began to dim, the road led them to a small village nestled at the foot of a distant mountain. The buildings were old and weathered, but there was a sense of normalcy. Lights flickered in the windows, and the distant sound of laughter floated through the air. Finally, Jake gasped, relief washing over him as they stumbled into the village square. But as they approached, the laughter faded, and the villagers turned to look at them with hollow eyes, their expressions unsettlingly blank. "Help us," Rachel cried, but the villagers remained silent, their mouths moving as if engaged in an endless conversation that held no sound. The two friends exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping in. "Maybe they know about the forest," Jake suggested, desperation creeping into his voice. But as they drew closer, the villagers began to shuffle backward, creating a barrier around them, blocking their way. Rachel felt a sense of dread wash over her. "What's happening?" she whispered, panic rising again. Suddenly, one of the villagers stepped forward, an old man with sunken cheeks and deep-set eyes. "You should not have come here," he rasped, his voice a low, eerie whisper. "The forest knows you. It will never let you go." The realization struck like a lightning bolt. "We have to get out," Rachel screamed, grabbing Jake's hand. They turned to flee, but the villagers closed in, their faces twisting into grotesque masks of anguish. "Please," Rachel begged, her heart racing as they backed away. The villagers advanced, whispering the same words over and over, a haunting melody of despair that reverberated through the air. "You cannot escape." Just then, the ground shook violently, and the village began to crumble. Cracks appeared in the cobblestones, and the air filled with a rancid smell, like decay and despair. The villagers screamed, but their cries were swallowed by the chaos, and the shadows from the forest surged into the square. "We need to go," Jake shouted, pulling Rachel away from the oncoming darkness. They sprinted toward the edge of the village, the shadows stretching out to grab them, pulling them back toward the horror forest. As they reached the outskirts, the fog rolled in once more, thickening around them. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, drowning out their screams. "You belong to us," they echoed, the voices merging into one, a chorus of despair that pierced their souls. In the chaos, Rachel felt a sudden tugging at her heart, as if something deep within her was awakening. She turned to Jake, her eyes wide with fear and determination. "We have to fight." They joined hands and concentrated on the light they had felt in their hearts, pushing back against the shadows that threatened to consume them. The darkness hissed and recoiled, and the whispers faltered for a brief moment. With a surge of strength, they screamed in unison. "We refuse to be afraid." The words echoed through the air, and the shadows shrank back, writhing in frustration. But the forest was relentless. The ground trembled beneath them, and the village began to dissolve, its inhabitants merging with the shadows, faces contorted in pain. "You will pay for this," the voice roared, shaking the very air around them. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a brilliant light burst forth from within Rachel and Jake, illuminating the darkness. The shadows screamed in agony, retreating into the depths of the forest, hissing as they fled. With the light surrounding them, they pushed forward, running toward the edge of the village, the forest receding behind them. As they burst into the open air, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing them in warmth. Panting and trembling, they looked back one last time. The horror forest stood silent, and still, its dark secrets hidden beneath the trees, but they knew it would always linger just out of sight. Rachel and Jake stumbled away from the village, hearts pounding with the knowledge that they had escaped, at least for now. But the forest's whispers would forever haunt their dreams, a reminder that some places were not meant to be trifled with. As they walked toward the rising sun, they vowed to never forget, to carry the light of their defiance against the darkness that lay just beyond the edge of the world. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows as Rachel and Jake trudged along the dirt path leading away from the village. Each step felt heavier, as if the very earth was reluctant to let them go. The forest loomed behind them, an ominous presence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. As they walked, the echoes of their experience in the horror forest replayed in their minds, shadows twisting, whispers clawing at their sanity, the desperate faces of the villagers. An unsettling feeling gnawed at Rachel's gut, a sense that their escape might not be as permanent as they hoped. "Do you think it's really over?" Jake asked, glancing back at the tree line. His voice trembled, mirroring the unease in Rachel's heart. Rachel hesitated. "I want to believe it is, but something feels off, like it's just waiting for us to let our guard down." Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the air, chilling them both. The whispers returned, softer now but still laced with malice, swirling around them like a ghostly fog. "You belong to us," they seemed to chant, lingering just at the edges of their hearing. Rachel and Jake quickened their pace, fear tightening its grip. As they reached the crest of a hill, they paused to catch their breath, looking back one last time at the forest. It stood dark and silent, but something flickered at its heart, a glimmer of movement that sent chills down their spines. "I don't want to go back," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," Rachel replied, her heart pounding. But just as they turned to continue down the hill, a piercing scream echoed through the air, a sound that chilled them to the bone. "Did you hear that?" Jake's eyes widened in horror. Rachel nodded, dread pooling in her stomach. "We need to keep moving." As they descended, the scream morphed into laughter, high-pitched and mocking, echoing through the trees. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, as if reaching for them, and Rachel felt an overwhelming urge to look back. "No, don't look," Jake pleaded, gripping her arm tightly. But it was too late. Rachel's gaze was drawn to the forest, and in that moment she saw it, the silhouettes of the villagers, their faces twisted in agony, emerging from the trees, beckoning them with skeletal hands. "Help us," they cried in unison, their voices a haunting melody that pierced the air. Panic surged through Rachel. "They're not real. They're part of the forest," she shouted, pulling Jake away. But the shadows danced closer, their voices growing louder, drowning out her words. "Rachel," Jake yelled, fear etched on his face. "We have to go. Now." With every ounce of strength, Rachel tore her gaze away from the nightmare unfolding behind them. "Run," she screamed, and they sprinted down the hill, the laughter following them like a dark spectre. The ground beneath them trembled, as if the forest was alive and angry, trying to reclaim its lost prey. Just when it felt like they would be pulled back into the abyss, they burst into a clearing bathed in golden sunlight, the warmth washing over them like a cleansing wave. But as they stopped to catch their breath, the whispers faded into an unsettling silence. They looked around, breathing heavily, the realization sinking in. They were free, but at what cost? Suddenly, the light dimmed and shadows crept into the clearing. Rachel and Jake exchanged terrified glances, feeling the forest's dark influence creeping back. The laughter began again, now mingling with anguished cries. "It's not over," Rachel whispered, her heart sinking. "We need to find a way to end this." Jake nodded, determination hardening in his eyes. "We'll figure it out together. We can't let it win." As they stepped forward, the sunlight flickered, and the forest loomed just beyond the clearing, dark and foreboding. Rachel knew the battle was far from over, but as long as they stood together, they would face whatever horrors lay ahead. With hearts pounding but spirits unyielded, they turned back toward the shadows, ready to confront the darkness that awaited them, knowing that the light within them would always be their greatest weapon against the malevolence of the horror forest.